Someone you love is going to die one day. You already know that. You have probably thought about it at a funeral, standing in black clothes, listening to a stranger read words about a life you knew far better than they did. It feels like the natural way to say goodbye. But the real answer of what humans actually do when death arrives is far stranger, far older, and far more surprising than a church pew in a printed program. Because long before funerals had flowers or hymns, your ancestors were already doing something remarkable. They were burying their dead on purpose, not by accident, not out of convenience, on purpose, with intention, with care. And the moment that behavior began is one of the strangest turning points in the story of what makes us human. Picture a cave in what is now Israel, roughly 100,000 years ago. Inside that cave, archaeologists found something that should not have existed that early. A human skeleton, curled on its side, with deer antlers placed carefully near the hands. This was not random. Someone chose those antlers. Someone arranged that body. Someone, in a world without written language, without metal tools, without permanent homes, still paused long enough to say, this person mattered, even now that they are gone. Anthropologist Paul Pettit, who has spent decades studying the earliest burial sites on Earth, argues that this moment marks something deeper than ritual. It marks the beginning of a mental leap. Early humans were starting to understand that death was not just an event, it was a boundary, a line between the world of the living and something else entirely. And once you understand that a boundary exists, you start building ways to mark it, to honor it, to make sense of it. Here is where the story gets even stranger. Humans were not the only ones doing this. Neanderthals, the close cousins of modern humans who lived across Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, also buried their dead. At a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers uncovered Neanderthal remains surrounded by clusters of pollen, suggesting flowers may have been placed with the body. For years, scientists debated whether this was intentional or simply pollen carried in by burrowing animals. But anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who has spent Neanderthal skeletal remains for most of his career, points to something harder to dismiss. The body itself was positioned deliberately, limbs arranged, placed in a shallow pit dug specifically to hold it. That is not an accident of nature. That is a decision. Think about what that means. A species often mocked in movies as brutish and simple was capable of grief, was capable of ritual, was capable of looking at a body and feeling something worth acting on. Doesn't that change how you picture them? But burial was only the beginning. As humans spread across the world, death practices split into wildly different directions, shaped by climate, belief, and the materials available. In some regions, bodies were buried in the fetal position, curled inward like they were returning to the earth the way they once emerged from the womb. In others, bodies were placed on raised platforms, left to the sky and the birds, a practice still followed today in parts of Tibet, known as sky burial. In colder climates, some groups preserve bodies rather than releasing them, keeping ancestors physically present within the community for generations. Here is the part that tends to surprise people the most. For a huge portion of human history, death was not hidden away in a separate building, run by professionals, tucked behind closed doors. Death happened at home. The dying were cared for by family. The body was washed by family. The burial or cremation was carried out by family. Death was not something you outsourced. It was something you were expected to face directly with your own hands. That is almost the opposite of how most of the modern world handles it now. Somewhere along the way, dying became something quiet, clinical, and distant. Hospitals took over the final moments. Funeral homes took over the body. Most people alive today have never washed or dressed someone who has died. Many have never even been in the room when it happened. Archaeologist and anthropologist Marta Mirason-Lar, who studies early human social behavior, has noted that this shift is remarkably recent in the scope of human history. For tens of thousands of years, death was communal. Now, for many people, it has become private, almost invisible until it suddenly isn't. So why did early humans go to such extraordinary lengths for their dead? Digging graves by hand, gathering flowers, carving markers into stone. Some researchers believe it was about protection, keeping predators and scavengers away from the body. But that explanation alone doesn't hold up. It doesn't explain the antlers. It doesn't explain the flowers. It doesn't explain the careful positioning of limbs as though the person were only sleeping. The more likely answer connects to something you still feel today. Grief needs an action. When someone you love dies, sitting still with that loss can feel unbearable. Digging, arranging, preparing, these are not just practical steps. They are ways of doing something with a pain that has nowhere else to go. Early humans may not have had the language to say, "I am grieving," but they clearly had the instinct to act on it. And that instinct never left you. Think about what people do today after a death. They light candles, they leave flowers at the site of an accident, they write messages on social media as though the person can somehow still read them. They visit graves, not because logic demands it, but because standing near that place feels different than standing anywhere else. None of that is required for survival. None of it changes anything physically. And yet, almost every human does some version of it. That's the same impulse that placed antlers beside a body 100,000 years ago. There's something quietly comforting in that connection. You're not inventing a new way to grieve. You're participating in one of the oldest continuous behaviors in the human story. Every stone marker, every flower left at a graveside, every quiet visit to a place where someone is buried, it all traces back to the same root. A species that refused to simply walk away from its dead. Modern death care is shifting again, and in some ways it's shifting backward towards something closer to how your ancestors handled it. Home funerals are becoming more common. Green burials, where a body is returned to the earth without embalming or a sealed casket, are growing in popularity. People are once again choosing to be present for the dying, to prepare the body themselves, to sit with the process rather than hand it entirely to strangers. In a strange way, the most modern approach to death is starting to look like the oldest one. So the next time you find yourself standing at a funeral, listening to unfamiliar words in an unfamiliar room, remember that the format is new. The impulse behind it is not. The instinct pulling you to mark this moment, to do something, to refuse to simply let a life pass without acknowledgement, that instinct is roughly 100,000 years old. Someone you love is going to die one day, and when that happens, you'll likely do something your ancestors would recognize instantly, even across 100,000 years of silence between you.